This is the story of how I found my grown son and my 2 grandsons living out of a car. How I learned that everything they lost had been taken from them legally and quietly. And how, step by step, we uncovered the truth and rebuilt a life that had been dismantled on paper. Nothing here happened fast. Nothing was fixed by shouting. And nothing was won by force. It was patience, records, and time. That changed everything. If stories about family, dignity, and starting over later than planned matter to you, subscribe to the channel. And before we continue, tell me where you're watching from. Some of the strongest people I hear from are the ones who had to rebuild without warning. Now let me take you back to where it started. I arrived at the airport earlier than planned. A delayed flight, an empty stomach, and that quiet impatience that comes with wanting to surprise your child. I hadn't told my son I was coming. I wanted to take him and the boys to breakfast. Sit somewhere warm and ordinary. Pretend, just for an hour, that life hadn't been pulling us in different directions. As I walked through the long-term parking lot, something made me slow down. A sedan? Parked too carefully. The windows were fogged from the inside. That shouldn't have mattered. Cars sit overnight all the time. But years teach you to listen when your body hesitates. Then I noticed a sneaker near the back seat. I stepped closer. In the back of the car, curled together under a thin blanket, were my 2 grandsons. Asleep in the kind of way children sleep when they're conserving energy. In the driver's seat sat my son, Marcus. His head rested against the steering wheel. His shoulders looked smaller than I remembered. Not weaker, just worn down. For a moment, I stayed where I was. Not because I didn't know what I was seeing, but because I didn't yet know how to step into it. This wasn't bad planning. This wasn't a rough patch. This was survival. I knocked softly on the window. Marcus startled awake. Panic crossed his face, then recognition. Then something heavier. Embarrassment. "Dad," he said quietly, stepping out and closing the door behind him. "You weren't supposed to see this." I wanted to ask everything at once. I wanted answers. I wanted to pretend the parking lot wasn't real. Instead, I asked the only question that mattered. "Are the boys okay?" He nodded. "They are," he said. "I make sure of that." That sentence told me everything. I woke the boys gently and promised pancakes. Real pancakes. Inside. Warm. They smiled like I'd offered them something rare. At breakfast, Marcus barely touched his food. He kept adjusting the boys' napkins, refilling their glasses, checking the door. Habits don't disappear just because you sit down. When I finally said, "Tell me what happened," he took a breath he'd clearly been holding for a long time. "She didn't just leave," he said. "She prepared." That word stayed with me. Prepared. As he explained, about paperwork, accounts, accusations, and systems that move faster than truth, I understood something important. This wasn't a man who had failed. This was a man who had been dismantled carefully, while everyone else called it a messy separation. And as I watched my grandsons laugh over syrup, I understood something else. This wasn't a problem I could fix with money or anger. This was a long game. And whoever did this believed no one would slow down long enough to see it clearly. They were wrong. Because once you see a pattern like this, you don't walk away from it. Marcus didn't tell the story all at once. He told it the way people do when they're still trying to understand it themselves. In fragments, pauses, and half-finished sentences. "She started handling the paperwork," he said quietly, staring into his coffee. "Just to help. That's what she said." I didn't interrupt. I'd learned long ago that rushing someone who's already been wounded only makes them retreat. They'd been married 12 years. Not perfect. But stable, or so he believed. When work got busy and money tightened, she offered to organize things. Bills. Insurance. Legal forms he didn't recognize but trusted, because they were presented calmly, late at night, when exhaustion makes agreement feel easier than questions. "I signed things I shouldn't have," he admitted. "Nothing dramatic. Just trusting." That trust became the opening. Bank accounts were separated quietly. His access was reduced, then questioned, then frozen. Temporarily. A business account he'd built over years was suddenly flagged for review. At the same time, complaints began to appear. Not loud accusations. Careful ones. Stress. Instability. Unpredictable behavior. Each concern sounded reasonable on its own. Together they formed a picture that wasn't true, but looked convincing enough to stand. Then came the restraining order. Temporary, they said. A precaution. It was granted before I even knew she'd filed. Marcus told me. I found out when I was told to leave. Leave your home. Leave your office. Leave your children, temporarily. That word again. Temporary has a way of becoming permanent when no one challenges it. He slept on couches at first. Friends who believed him, but didn't want to be involved. Then motels. Then the car, when the numbers stopped making sense. And the boys? I asked. He swallowed. Supervised visits. Twice a week. Like he was dangerous. What reason did they give? I asked. He let out a hollow breath. That I was volatile. Marcus. The man who apologized to furniture when he bumped into it. They didn't need proof, he said quietly. They needed a story. The hardest part wasn't the money. It wasn't the humiliation of supervision. It wasn't even the whispers he could feel following him into rooms. It was the waiting. Waiting for hearings. Waiting for responses. Waiting for someone, anyone, to look closely enough to see what didn't add up. And every time I tried to explain, he said, I sounded defensive. Which just made it worse. I nodded. Systems like this don't reward emotion. They reward documentation, something he'd never been given time to gather. As he spoke, I began to notice the pattern he hadn't named yet. Legal filings timed around paydays. Accusations filed just before weekends. Documents served when responses would be delayed. This wasn't chaos. It was choreography. Did anyone ever ask to see your records? I asked. He shook his head. They said it wasn't relevant yet. That's when something settled in me, not anger. Certainty. This wasn't about who was right. It was about who had prepared. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. Listen to me, I said. You didn't lose everything because you failed. He looked up, eyes rimmed red. You lost it because someone understood the system better than you did. That mattered. Because systems can be learned. Timelines can be traced. And truth, when it's patient, has a way of surfacing. But only if someone is willing to slow everything down. And ask the questions no one else wants to. As we gathered our things and the boys tugged at my coat, eager to go somewhere warm again, I made a decision without announcing it. This would stop being a story about survival. It would become a story about recovery. And the first step wasn't confrontation. It was understanding exactly how the system had been used against my son. So we could use it properly for once. Because once you see how a life was taken apart, you can begin putting it back together. Piece by piece. The hardest thing to explain isn't what Marcus lost. It's how official everything looked while it was happening. From the outside, nothing appeared violent or cruel. There were no raised voices in courtrooms. No dramatic confrontations. Just documents. Schedules. Polite instructions delivered by people who believed they were doing their jobs. But what those documents created was something far more damaging. Control. That afternoon, Marcus showed me the visitation schedule. 2 days a week. 1 hour each time. Supervised. A social worker present. Notebook always open. It's like visiting my own children in a waiting room, he said quietly. I have to measure every word. The boys weren't afraid. They were confused. They didn't understand why their father suddenly needed permission to hug them. Or why they couldn't leave the building together. And confusion, I learned, is one of the sharpest tools in this kind of abuse. Because children fill the gaps with whatever explanation feels safest. She tells them I'm sick, Marcus said. Not dangerous. Just unstable. That word again. Unstable. It appeared everywhere. In filings. In quiet comments from school staff. In the careful tone people used when they spoke to him. No one accused him directly. They didn't need to. The system did it for them. Every supervised visit was logged. Every hesitation noted. Every emotional moment interpreted as confirmation of what had already been decided. If Marcus was calm, he was detached. If he showed emotion, he was volatile. There was no correct way to exist inside that box. I listened and felt something unexpected, not outrage, but recognition. I'd seen this before. Systems designed to protect can become tools of pressure when someone understands how to guide them quietly. What happens if you challenge it? I asked. He shook his head. They say I'm not cooperating. That's how coercion hides. It doesn't demand obedience. It rewards compliance. Marcus had tried to push back once. Filed a motion. Asked for a review. The response came weeks later. Denied. The reason cited, lack of stability, due to housing uncertainty. Which would have been easier to fix if he hadn't been ordered to leave his home in the first place. Perfectly circular. By the time he finished explaining, the coffee in front of me had gone cold. This isn't divorce, I said finally. This is leverage. He looked at me, surprised. What do you mean? I mean someone figured out how to use procedure to control the outcome. Before anyone ever examined the facts. He exhaled slowly, like someone hearing a truth they hadn't had words for. That was the moment the story shifted. This wasn't about proving Marcus was a good father. It wasn't about convincing anyone emotionally. It was about interrupting a process that had been allowed to run unchecked. And to do that, I said, we have to change the terrain. Has anyone evaluated you independently? I asked. He frowned. They used her therapist's notes. That's not independent, I said. That's strategy. Something straightened in him then. Not hope, orientation. Like someone finally seeing the map instead of the maze. We're not going to argue with the system, I continued. We're going to give it information it can't ignore. Financial records. Timelines. Third-party evaluations. Stability that exists on paper, not just intention. He nodded slowly. What about the boys? He asked. They're the ones stuck in the middle. That's why we move carefully, I said. No accusations. No emotional displays. Just clarity. Because once clarity enters a system like this, it forces questions. And questions are dangerous to any story built on assumption. As we left the cafe, Marcus paused beside the car and looked at his sons through the window. They're growing up in this, he said quietly. No, I replied. They're growing out of it. At the time, I didn't know how long this would take. Months. Possibly years. But I knew one thing with certainty. This kind of abuse survives on exhaustion and silence. And neither of us was willing to offer either anymore. The next step wouldn't involve confrontation or courtrooms. It would begin with a single phone call. One that would quietly change the direction of everything. The call came 2 days later, early in the morning. Not urgent. Not dramatic. Just a calm voice asking careful questions. Her name was Linda. She came recommended by someone who didn't advertise her work, and that mattered to me. People who win loud cases often lose quiet ones. We didn't need speeches. We needed someone who understood systems. She listened while Marcus told the story again, the paperwork, the restraining order, the supervised visits, the money that vanished before anyone thought to follow it. Linda didn't interrupt. When he finished, there was a pause on the line. Long enough to feel intentional. This isn't unusual, she said finally. It's just well executed. Marcus stiffened. I heard it in his breathing. Well executed? He repeated. Yes, she said. Which means it's traceable. That was the first time anyone had framed this as something solvable. Linda didn't start with custody. She didn't start with emotion. She started with money. Control almost always leaves a financial trail, she explained. Even when people think they've buried it. She asked about accounts Marcus no longer had access to. About joint loans he assumed were closed. About family members who had suddenly stepped in to help. That's when Marcus mentioned his former father-in-law. Quiet. Wealthy. Always present when decisions were made. I never thought he was involved, Marcus said. He just advised. Linda hummed softly. Advice often comes with fingerprints. She laid out the plan slowly, carefully, like someone building something meant to hold weight. First, an independent psychological evaluation. Not to prove sanity, but to remove doubt. Second, stable housing. Documented. Lease, utilities, routine. Third, forensic accounting. Forensic? Marcus asked. Yes, Linda said. We don't argue stories. We follow transactions. She explained how repeated small transfers, consistent timing, and third-party payments often reveal coordination. Not obvious theft. Influence. By the end of the call, Marcus looked different. Still tired. Still hurting. But no longer lost. That afternoon, we drove to a small clinic across town. No rush. No defensiveness. Marcus answered questions honestly, without oversharing. The psychologist didn't look impressed. She didn't look concerned. She looked bored. Under the circumstances, that was perfect. You're not unstable, she said afterward. You're exhausted. That sentence would matter later. The accounting took longer. Weeks, not days. On the surface, nothing changed. Supervised visits continued. Court dates stayed distant. His former wife remained calm. Too calm. Linda noticed it too. People who think they're winning get sloppy, she said. They repeat themselves. And they did. Transfers made on the same dates each month. Payments routed through the same intermediary. Documents signed digitally from the same IP address. Patterns. The kind Marcus had missed before. The kind we now watched closely. One evening, Linda called again. I think we found something, she said. I didn't ask what. I already knew what it meant. The story we'd been told, about chaos, instability, emotional breakdown, couldn't survive structure. Because structure reveals intention. And intention changes everything. Marcus hung up and looked at me, relief and fear tangled together. What happens now? He asked. No, I said. We stop reacting. Because the moment you stop reacting, the other side starts explaining. And explanations create records. The next phase wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be confrontational. It would be quiet. Precise. Patient. And for the first time since I found my son asleep in that parking lot, something finally shifted. Not hope. Momentum. Whatever dismantled his life had done so slowly. And that meant we could reverse it the same way. One documented step at a time. For a while, nothing happened. And that was the hardest part. Learning to sit still while other people believed they were still in control. Marcus stayed inside the routine. Supervised visits. Check-ins. Carefully polite replies to messages that carried just enough pressure to test him. From the outside, he looked cooperative. Predictable. Underneath, the ground was moving. Linda worked quietly. She didn't chase big numbers or dramatic transfers. She focused on repetition, the kind that seems harmless once, but impossible to ignore when lined up side by side. Small deposits into accounts Marcus didn't recognize. Payments labeled support that never reached him. Legal fees covered by someone other than his former wife. The story says she's struggling, Linda explained during one meeting. The numbers say she's being backed. That was the first crack. The forensic accountant joined soon after. He wasn't emotional. He didn't speculate. He sent spreadsheets. Timelines. Flow charts. Money moved in careful loops. Never directly. Always through a third party. Always at the same time each month. Always just below thresholds that would trigger automatic review. It's not theft, he said. It's influence. Influence that paid rent. Influence that covered legal costs. Influence that allowed one side to wait indefinitely while the other slowly bled out. Marcus stared at the charts, shaking his head. I thought she was just managing better than me. That's exactly what it's designed to look like, I said. Then came the harder discovery. One payment traced back to a consulting firm Marcus recognized, a company his former father-in-law had once bragged about using to structure assets. The name appeared again and again. Not as a signer. Not as an owner. As a facilitator. That makes him careful, Linda said. And careful people leave longer trails. At the same time, another thread began to unravel. The therapist's notes being used against Marcus were reviewed independently. Patterns emerged, selective quotations. Missing context. Conclusions that didn't match the sessions themselves. Not falsified. Curated. And when curation is exposed, it stops looking accidental. By the time Linda prepared the motion, we weren't asking the court to believe Marcus. We were asking it to compare. Compare financial claims against records. Compare instability allegations against evaluations. Compare timelines against reality. That's when the pressure shifted. Marcus's former wife began sending longer messages. More explanations. More concern. She asked about delays. About why things were taking so long. She was still calm. But no longer relaxed. People who expect silence don't prepare for scrutiny. Linda filed the motion quietly. No grand language. No accusations. Just exhibits. Attachments. Requests. This time, the court responded faster. A review was scheduled. Limited at first. Financial scope only. But even that changed the tone. Marcus received a notice revising visitation terms pending review. Still supervised, but longer. More flexible. A subtle acknowledgement that the ground wasn't as solid as it had been. The boys noticed immediately. Why do we get more time now? One of them asked. Marcus smiled gently. Because people are paying closer attention. That night, he sat in the car afterward longer than usual, watching the lights inside the building turn off one by one. They really thought no one would look, he said. They counted on exhaustion, I replied. Exhaustion of money. Exhaustion of patience. Exhaustion of belief. But exhaustion cuts both ways. Because once you see a system clearly enough, you stop fighting it emotionally. You start documenting it. And documentation wakes people up. The thread they believed no one would ever notice was visible now. Not pulled. Not yanked. Just held. And when you hold a thread like that long enough, everything built around it starts to loosen. The next step wouldn't feel dramatic. But it would be decisive. Because once influence is exposed, any story that depends on it can't survive in open air. The hearing wasn't announced as a turning point. It appeared on the calendar like any other entry, a financial review, limited scope, scheduled for 90 minutes. No promises. No expectations. Just an opportunity for the court to clarify inconsistencies. That wording mattered. Courts don't like drama. They like inconsistencies. Marcus dressed plainly that morning. No suit. No statement. Just clean clothes and steady posture, the kind that says you're not here to perform. Inside the courtroom, the energy felt different from the earlier hearings Marcus had described. Less rushed. Less dismissive. The judge asked questions before anyone started arguing. That alone told me something had shifted. Linda began the presentation slowly. No accusations. No adjectives. Just dates, amounts, and repetition. Transfers that appeared every month. Legal fees paid by third parties. Housing expenses that didn't match declared income. When the judge asked Marcus's former wife to explain the discrepancies, she did what she'd always done. She minimized. Family help, she said. Temporary support. The judge nodded once. Then asked quietly, "Which family member?" The pause that followed was longer than any answer. She named her father. Linda placed the next document on the stand, consulting firm records. The same firm tied to multiple transfers. The same firm routing payments that kept the pressure one-sided while appearing neutral. The judge leaned forward. "And what role does this firm play in your financial life?" he asked. Her answer drifted. "Too far. Too loosely." The forensic accountant testified next. He didn't sound angry. He sounded precise. "This pattern," he explained, "is consistent with sustained financial backing intended to influence legal outcomes without direct attribution." Influence. In a courtroom, that word doesn't accuse. It clarifies. Then came the therapist's notes. The independent evaluator walked the court through what was missing: selective quotations, absent context, conclusions unsupported by the sessions themselves. Not lies, but manipulation. When Marcus was invited to speak, he stood slowly. He didn't rush. "I've complied with every request," he said. "I've waited when told to wait. I've cooperated when told to cooperate. I'm only asking the court to look at the full picture." He didn't mention pain. He didn't mention betrayal. He mentioned consistency. The judge sat back, hands folded. "I'm concerned," he said slowly, "that this case has relied too heavily on narrative, and not enough on verification." The room went still. That sentence didn't sound dramatic. But it changed everything. The court ordered two things. First, a full financial review, expanded beyond the initial scope. Second, an immediate custody adjustment. Unsupervised visits, pending final determination. Not permanent. Not celebratory. But real. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment when he heard it. Just long enough to steady himself. Outside the courtroom, no one spoke right away. Other cases moved around us. Other lives continued unfolding. For us, the noise felt far away. "They finally looked," Marcus said. "Yes," I replied. "And once a court looks closely, it can't unsee what's there." This wasn't the end. There were still filings ahead. Still consequences moving quietly in the background. But the balance had shifted. The system that once moved too fast to notice him was now moving carefully. And careful movement favors truth. As we reached the car, Marcus checked his phone. A message from the visitation center. Updated schedule confirmed. No supervision. No notes. Just time. He stared at the screen longer than necessary. "They thought they could wear me down," he said. "They tried," I replied. "But patience cuts deeper than pressure." The final outcome hadn't arrived yet. But the direction was clear. And sometimes direction matters more than speed, because it tells you where the story is actually going. The weeks after the hearing didn't feel victorious. They felt careful. Marcus didn't celebrate the unsupervised visits. He treated them the way you treat something fragile, with attention and respect. He arrived early. He left on time. He followed instructions even when they no longer made sense. Not out of fear. Out of understanding. Stability isn't declared. It's demonstrated. The boys noticed immediately. No clipboards. No strangers watching from the corner. No conversations measured for tone. Just their father. They talked about school. Cartoons. Small arguments that didn't matter. And when the visits ended, they hugged him without hesitation, a simple act that said more than any ruling ever could. Behind the scenes, the financial review continued. Quietly. Methodically. No announcements. No accusations. Just requests for clarification that could no longer be ignored. Bank statements expanded. Third-party transfers questioned. Consulting arrangements examined under light instead of assumption. The story that once sounded tidy began to fracture. Marcus's former wife grew distant. Her messages shortened. The confidence she'd worn so comfortably no longer fit. The court didn't punish loudly. It corrected. Custody adjusted over time, not as a reward, but as a response to evidence. The boys transitioned back into their father's home gradually, supported by routines and consistency instead of promises. Marcus found work again. Nothing glamorous. Something stable. Enough to rebuild without borrowing dignity from anyone else. One evening, after the boys were asleep, he sat across from me at the kitchen table, a real table this time, and said something I won't forget. "They didn't destroy me," he said. "They just counted on me staying quiet forever." That was the miscalculation. Because silence is only powerful when it's chosen. What this experience took from us was time, months that should have been ordinary, years we won't get back. What it gave us was clarity. Marcus learned to question paperwork that arrived too smoothly. The boys learned that truth doesn't always arrive quickly, but it arrives. And I learned that helping doesn't always mean rescuing. Sometimes it means standing beside someone while they reclaim themselves. There was no dramatic confrontation. No family showdown. The court handled what needed handling. Life moved forward the way it usually does, quietly, unevenly, without offering apologies where you might want them. And that was enough. Because the goal was never revenge. It was restoration. Watching Marcus rebuild wasn't inspiring in the loud way stories often try to be. It was inspiring in the way real recovery looks: slow mornings, steady work, children laughing in the next room. Ordinary. Hard-earned. If there's one thing I'd tell anyone watching this, it's this. When systems are used against you, emotion won't save you. Patience might. Documentation will. And clarity always does. And if you ever find someone you love sleeping in a place they were never meant to be, a car, a hallway, a waiting room, don't ask first what they did wrong. Ask who prepared. Because most destruction like this doesn't happen in chaos. It happens quietly. And quiet things can be undone. If you're willing to slow down long enough to see how they were built. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If stories like this matter to you, stories about family, dignity, and starting over later than planned, consider subscribing. And before you go, tell me where you're watching from. Because every time someone listens to a story like this, it becomes a little harder for the truth to be buried again.